Just last week, the United States and Taiwan came to a historically significant agreement on the first portion of the 21st Century Trade Initiative, strengthening ties between the two, between the US and Taiwan. So proponents say that the agreement also strengthens Taiwan's ability to resist economic coercion from mainland China. So as with many recent examples of cooperation, think of Nancy Pelosi's trip, or President Tsai, her brief visit to the US. This agreement has drawn the ire of mainland China, which has already seen increasing challenges in the relationship. So as concern rises over China's military capabilities and new forms of pressure exerted on Taiwan, where does this triangle of relations stand? And what role should the US play? So we are going to tackle these simple questions tonight and more in tonight's discussion. So hi, everybody. I'm Mary Eintema, president of World Boston, and it's a great pleasure to say hello to you all here in the room and also those of you online here at Chat and Chowder. We are joined obviously tonight by the people in the room and also people on Zoom, to use a New England pronunciation. So we're really happy to be with you virtually or in person. Right away, we have to thank our hosts at Foley and Lardner for their kind hospitality. I also want to shout out Natalie Mace, our Director of Operations and Global Engagement, who is doing everything to make this event happen, along with other great World Boston colleagues. So I also want to point out that we're really pleased to be able to offer Chat and Chowder free of charge to first timers. And also, as those of you who've been here before know, we try and keep our prices very, very low. So if you are coming for the first time, if you're bringing someone for the first time, it's really so appreciated that you attend because we're offering this free of charge. So please keep that in mind. All right, onward. A few reminders. As you may know, the mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. And so we appreciate you being part of that mission, and we hope that you will consider helping us out financially. You heard what I just said, before, so that we can keep on doing these things. So please do learn more at worldboston.org. All right, so housekeeping. Tonight, when we go to the audience for Q&A, we're going to ask you to come up to the mics at the front of the room. This is all so that we can also participate with our friends online. And we will invite you to come up to the mic so we don't have a line of people waiting. And please speak into both of them for both streams. We will take, we'll try and take a couple of questions from Zoom, but we won't bring you up on camera as we do when we're doing a Zoom only event. All right. And by the way, I'm apologizing ahead of time if I have to use my phone. It is just the best way to stay in touch with my colleagues in the room. So now, at last, it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ryan Hass. So for the sake of time, I'm going to abbreviate his impressive biography, but please do read it in full on our website. So Ryan Hass is a senior fellow and the Michael H. Armacost Chair in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, where he holds a joint appointment to the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He's also the Chen Fu and Cecilia Yen Ku Chair in Taiwan Studies. You win the longest title award. He is also part of the inaugural class of the David M. Rubenstein Fellows at Brookings, and is now a fellow at the Sci China Center at the Yale Law School. So Ryan Hass focuses on political, economic, and security challenges facing the US and East Asia. From 2013 to 2017, he served as the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the National Security Council, where he advised President Obama and senior White House officials on all aspects of US policy toward China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. Prior to that, he served as a Foreign Service officer. We have some other former FSOs here at the US Embassy in a country which is on this page, in Beijing, where he earned the State Department Director General's Award for Impact. And originality in reporting. So Ryan Hass is the author or co-author of several books, including the subject of tonight's discussion at Chat and Chowder, which was published just in April, US-Taiwan Relations. Will China's challenge lead to a crisis? And coincidentally, it will be available for purchase after the event, and it's also in a link in the chat box on Zoom. So with that, please welcome Ryan and thank him for joining us this evening.
Well, Mary, thank you for such a warm introduction. It's really nice to be with you all. I appreciate the invitation from World Boston. I'm going to try to be efficient with my remarks because I think the real value of our time together is going to come from our discussion. I should also say at the outset that my emotions are not tied to any of this analysis, so I welcome anyone to challenge, critique, or offer candid feedback on it. Well, let's jump into it. So I want to start by setting a little bit of context for our discussion tonight. This is a comment that Taiwan's Minister of Defense made several weeks ago on May 8th. He said that his forces would be prepared to defend Taiwan and its people, its materials, and its strategic resources. He said, if you want to bomb this or that, we will not tolerate it, which is normal enough, reasonable enough, assuming that he's talking about the risk of China attacking Taiwan, except that he wasn't. He was talking about and responding to a statement that Congressman Moulton had made recently, that the United States should be prepared to blow up Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company if China ever were to invade Taiwan. So in other words, he was explaining that Taiwan is preparing itself to defend against the possibility of an American attack upon the crown jewel of Taiwan's economy, because we would be afraid of we would want to prevent it from falling into China's hands. And this is the upside down, black is white world that we're living in when we're talking about and thinking about Taiwan these days. So why would an American congressman be talking about blowing up a Taiwan company? Congressman Moulton, some of you may know, he's a representative representing the 6th District in Massachusetts. He's a former officer in the Marine Corps. He's a rising star within his party. He has strong national security credentials. He is not a fringe member of Congress. He wasn't speaking off the cuff. He was speaking at the Milken Institute's annual conference in front of a group of financiers, thought leaders, members of the media. This wasn't a low-key setting to spitball a few off the wall ideas. Now, I wanted to start here because I think that it sheds light on a few important dynamics that are at play in the US-Taiwan relationship. And I will get to China as well in a moment. So to really think about this, I think we need to first start out by thinking about why Taiwan matters so much. Why is there so much energy and attention from the president on down being devoted to Taiwan these days? And I will put in front of you four reasons why I think Taiwan is so consequential. The first is that Taiwan is the beating heart of the global economy. It is what makes the global economy run. It produces the world's most advanced semiconductor chips that run everything from our cars to our computers, our refrigerators, our cell phones, and it's dominant in this space. As many people think about dominance in critical sectors, they often think about OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC has about a 40% share of the world's oil production. Taiwan's share of global chip production is 90%, so more than double for chips what OPEC is for oil. And as a result, the United States trades more with Taiwan than it does with France, than it does with India, and than it does with every other country in the world, with the exception of 7 other countries. Taiwan is America's 8th largest trading partner. The second reason why Taiwan matters so much is because there's frankly just broad public support and sympathy in the United States for Taiwan. This is driven by shared interests, it's driven by shared values, and in part by America's tradition of standing up for the little guy who's being bullied by a big neighbor. And this support is reflected in public opinion polls, it's reflected in the enthusiasm that members of Congress have for Taiwan, and it's also reflected in the frequency with which our president talks about Taiwan. He has promised on 4 different occasions that the United States would be prepared to come to Taiwan's defense militarily if it were attacked by China. The third reason why Taiwan matters so much is that it's critical to the credibility of America's security commitments. America's superpower status is sort of built upon the foundation of our alliance network around the world. Our alliance network is premised upon the foundation of our commitments to our partners being credible. And Taiwan is often seen as the canary in the coal mine. If the United States were to back away from or abandon Taiwan, it would have spillover and knock-on effects for the credibility of our commitments to all of our other allies and partners around the world. And it could lead to the erosion and unraveling of America's alliance network. The other reason why Taiwan matters so much is that it is sort of the fulcrum of preservation of peace and stability in Asia. If there is instability in the Taiwan Strait, there will be massive disruptions in the region of the world that is the global engine of growth. And this helps get us into why Taiwan has become such a hot topic. We feel very deeply invested in preserving Taiwan's peace and stability, but we also, I think, as Americans, we feel a growing sense of urgency around Taiwan issues. Commentators are often talking about the issue now. Our admirals and generals are forecasting dates of possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The Economist magazine has labeled Taiwan the most dangerous place on earth. But why? Why is there so much intensity around the issue now? I don't think there's any one single explanation for why there's so much intensity around the Taiwan issue. I think that there's a combination of factors that are all sort of feeding into each other. One is that, you know, the global war on terror has ended. We have withdrawn from Afghanistan. A lot of people who were previously experts in Iraq and Afghanistan have become overnight experts on Taiwan issues. The second is Ukraine. Ukraine has provided sort of a vivid reminder of the fact that that big powers trying to gobble up smaller powers is not a 21st century or a 20th century conceit, that this is something that is still a real risk. But there's also sort of the speed and scale of China's military modernization, which continues to exceed and outpace our expectations and forecast for the rate of their growth. And China has become more brazen in their use of military instruments around Taiwan. They now practice and exercise to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west of Taiwan. We also have a diminishing confidence in our capability to read Xi Jinping's intentions. As more power becomes concentrated in Beijing around Xi Jinping, and we have less and less insight and frequency of interaction with him, I think that there's just more uncertainty about what his intentions and plans are. And then on top of all this, there is sort of this fear that the people of Taiwan are complacent about what we see as this mounting risk to the security of Taiwan. If you look at the portion of the government pie in Taiwan that is devoted to defense issues, it has remained the same for the past decade. It's around 11% of the overall government expenditures. And so while we in the United States are busy warning about the risks of Taiwan security, the people of Taiwan have decided that their overall allocation of governmental priorities shouldn't be terribly affected by the environment that they live in. And part of this is the fact that they've lived in the same environment for the past 60 years. They've grown pretty familiar with the challenges and threats. And so given all of this, it sort of raises the question, is our current strategy for Taiwan enough? And this leads us back to Congressman Moulton's comments a few weeks ago. I think, I haven't spoken with him, but I think that he was reflecting a sentiment that I hear often from members of Congress, that there is an inevitability to eventual conflict in the Taiwan Strait. We don't know when, but we think that it may happen. And there is just this growing presumption that at some point China is going to invade Taiwan. And this presumption is compelling members of Congress to search for new, big, bold, creative ideas for deterring or dissuading that eventuality. And for some members of Congress, it is motivating them to try to put pressure on the Department of Defense to accelerate their preparations for potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait, to move more capabilities and field new capabilities to try to deter China. For others, it's causing them to argue that the United States needs to abandon Ukraine so that we can focus and concentrate our efforts and our energies on deterring and, if necessary, defending Taiwan. And then for some, it's causing them to sort of look outside the box and think creatively about steps that could be taken to alter Beijing's calculus to compel them to think that the cost would exceed the benefits of invading Taiwan. And I think that that is where the congressman's views were being informed. Now, the assumption in this thought process is that China wants to invade Taiwan because it wants to gain control of semiconductor chips, which are the lifeblood of the global economy. And once it has gained control of this critical sector, then it will have leverage to expand its influence and its reach to other parts of the world. And so, in other words, Taiwan and what it produces are a strategic asset of the United States that we want to keep in our fold and keep away from China. Now, this idea of Taiwan as a strategic asset is not a new concept. It has long historical roots. General MacArthur made this argument at the end of World War II, that Taiwan is an unsinkable aircraft carrier that must be kept on our team. There is this view now that, that Taiwan is the cork in the bottle of China's expansionist impulses. So the thinking goes, if China were to gain control of Taiwan, then it may go to the Philippines next, and on and on and on. And if such a thought sounds familiar, it should, because it rhymes with history. This was the argument, the domino effect argument, that was used to advocate for American involvement in Vietnam. And these arguments are being fueled, in Washington at least, by this sense, this fear that China is winning. And if China is winning, then the United States must be losing. And this is an understandable emotion, but it's also wrongheaded. The reason why it's wrongheaded is because differences between Beijing and Taipei are an artifact of an unresolved civil war between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. And for Beijing, Taiwan is the last jewel in the crown. The Chinese Communist Party, when they were founded, one of their promises to their people was that they would unite all of Greater China underneath one banner, that they would restore China to its past glory, so that Xinjiang and Tibet and Hong Kong and Taiwan would all come underneath the banner of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong now are under effective control of Beijing, but Taiwan is not. And this isn't just a thought that resides in the Chinese Communist Party. It's also an idea that has roots back to the Qing Dynasty and before. Now, I want to note that our friends in Taiwan are similarly determined to preserve their autonomy and their democratic way of life. But the broader point I'm trying to leave you with is that China didn't become inspired to conquer Taiwan because of semiconductor chips. They have had the same goal during periods when China was weak, during the Cultural Revolution when China was in tumult, when America had unrivaled primacy in our unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War, and on to today. And so thinking about Taiwan in the context of only semiconductor chips, I think misses the story. And threatening to blow up Taiwan's most important company, and frankly, the world's most consequential company, is not going to dampen China's appetite for Taiwan, but it will do enormous destruction to the US-Taiwan relationship. I think it's fair to say that our friends in Taiwan resent the idea of America attacking TSMC. And this is the risk of allowing US-China rivalry to sort of gallop ahead and subsume America's relationship with Taiwan. If the US-Taiwan relationship becomes subordinated to rivalry with China, the impulse to instrumentalize Taiwan for strategic competition with China will only grow stronger and stronger. And it will become more and more common for American leaders to lose sight of the fact that Taiwan is a critical partner on its own, whom we share common interests with and common values. And to be clear, what I'm warning about is not some imagined future hypothetical scenario. It's an active conversation in Taiwan today. There already are voices in Taiwan who are beginning to question America's motives for its relationship with Taiwan. And so this is part of the reason why Richard Bush, Bonnie Glaser, and I wrote this book. We wanted to help sort of get back to basics a bit on what the nature of the US-China-Taiwan dynamic is, what has allowed us to preserve and protect our interests for the past 40 plus years, and what lessons we should draw from that experience to inform our way forward. We wrote this book in the spring of 2021, shortly after a US Admiral, Admiral Davidson, had projected the possibility that China may invade Taiwan by 2027. And our concern was that these types of projections based upon little information risked playing into Beijing's efforts to wear down the psychological will of the people of Taiwan. And they also fed impulses to treat Taiwan as this pawn in a great power competition between the United States and China. And so we wrote an op-ed expressing our views and our concerns. We sent it to the New York Times. We sent it to the Washington Post. We sent it to the Wall Street Journal. If you haven't seen the op-ed, I will forgive you because it wasn't published in any of those places. It was published on the NPR website. And so we got together afterwards for lunch to lick our wounds about the fact that we've been rejected so much. And we said, damn it, we need to do something about these troubling trend lines, because if we don't, they're just going to continue to gallop ahead. And this book is a product of our effort to try to do something about this. And part of what we're trying to do is to sort of ground the discussion in some first principles on what has guided America's efforts on Taiwan and what lessons we should draw. So one of the first principles is a stubborn insistence that cross-strait issues must be resolved peacefully, but they must be resolved in a way that reflect the views and wishes of the people of Taiwan. The people of Taiwan, after all, have a democratic system that allows them to register their views. But there's also a need for an awareness that Taiwan isn't a problem with an American solution. And this runs a bit against the grain of how we think about our role in the world. But the fact is that neither side of the Taiwan Strait seeks our involvement or mediation in their longstanding dispute. So the goal of American policy isn't necessarily to try to solve the Taiwan problem, it's to keep a path open for the problem to be solved eventually. Our goal is to preserve peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. That's the North Star of our policy. And I think it's also important for us to remember that the people of Taiwan deserve to have agency in their own future as well. There are 23 million people who don't look to the United States to tell them what their interests are. They're very able to identify their own interests. But ultimately, one of the arguments that we wanted to leave you with is a view that Taiwan is not a card that the United States should play in its competition with China. Being for Taiwan is not a way of showing toughness against China. Friends don't treat friends as pawns or sources of leverage. Now, I expect that some people will be listening to this and thinking, yeah, that's all fine and good. That worked for the past 40 years. But the China that we face today is different than the China that we faced 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and our policy needs to adapt with it. And I think that's a fair point or a fair question to ask. So let me just try to address it a little bit now. I do think that Xi Jinping is different than his predecessors. I think he's more aggressive, he's more ambitious. I think he's more impatient than his recent predecessors has been. I've had a chance to be in 13 or 14 meetings with him, and I've had an opportunity to take a measure of the man, and I think that we should take him deadly seriously. It's also important that President Xi has linked unification of China with Taiwan with the great project of national rejuvenation. So the idea that China will become rejuvenated by 2049, which is the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And so implicitly, Xi Jinping has suggested that there is a deadline to this project. We know that Xi Jinping has instructed his military to be prepared by 2027 for the possibility of a conflict. We also know that he is working to harden his economy as he watches Russia's get ground down as a consequence of its invasion of Ukraine. So these are discontinuities. They do provide a powerful reminder that the risk is not zero, that there will be a conflict. But when I look at the big picture, I think that General Austin, And General Milley have a point when they say publicly and privately that conflict in the Taiwan Strait is neither imminent nor inevitable. Part of the reason why that is the case is that Xi Jinping is telling his people that they're winning, that their current approach is working. And this suggests that Xi Jinping has confidence, or at least he wants to project the sense of confidence, that the path that Beijing currently is on is going to lead eventually to the goal that they have set of absorbing Taiwan. So what is he confident about? What are they trying to do? Our argument is that the real sort of crux of their strategy is a strategy of coercion without violence. It's to wear down the psychological will of the people of Taiwan to resist, to convince the people of Taiwan that resistance is futile, that their best path to peace and prosperity runs through Beijing. And so seen through this light, the center of gravity, the most important variable is the will of the Taiwan people. Beijing wants to convince the Taiwan people that they live in a society that's isolated internationally, that's fractured and divided domestically, and that they are making a bad bet by relying upon the United States because the United States is unreliable. Now, the military dimension plays a role in this overall strategy. It is used both to try to discourage Taiwan from moving in the direction of independence, but also to deter the United States from getting involved, because ultimately, I think the Chinese believe that if they can isolate the problem to a China versus Taiwan issue, that they can impose their will eventually on the people of Taiwan. So their goal is to really try to push us out, push other countries out, and just sort of isolate Taiwan and deal with them on their own. But just to take this point slightly further, there has been analysis by the Department of Defense recently that suggests that China is not making the investments that you would expect a country to make if they are preparing to embark upon a 1,000,000-man swim across a 100-mile moat that is the Taiwan Strait. But let's be clear, China is taking plenty of actions that are putting psychological stress on the people of Taiwan. These yellow boxes are areas where drills have been done by the People's Liberation Army around Taiwan. You can see to the north, south, east, and west, including after Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan last year. So let me just close by offering a thought on what it is that we should be trying to do rather than viewing this solely as a military challenge. I think if we're determined to uphold our interests in the Taiwan Strait, we need to take a more holistic approach to the Taiwan challenge rather than viewing it through the narrow straw of a military counting exercise. And this is what this book is trying to do. It's trying to push us beyond this war-peace binary to take a fresh look at what China is doing, at how the United States and Taiwan can most effectively respond, and what America's top priorities are with respect to Taiwan. And I would argue that our top priority is to maintain peace and stability. That's the crux of the exercise. And what is success? Success is ensuring that Taiwan has the ability to preserve its political autonomy, its economic vibrancy, that it's capable of enjoying dignity and respect on the world stage, and doing all those things without conflict. So being strong isn't enough. We're also going to have to be smart in the way that we approach this challenge. And hopefully this book helps us move us in that direction. I really look forward to our conversation now.
All right, thank you very much. I have a feeling that we are going to have some questions. Okay, so Ed, go ahead, and then Brandon.
Yeah, thank you for your talk today. You talked about, I hadn't heard that Moulton said we were going to blow up TSMC, but why aren't they willing to do it? Why has Taiwan willing to do it if they're invaded? What have they done to prepare? Because the truth is, we're not coming. We recognize them as part of China. We recognize one China. There's no, in most war games, I hadn't heard about the DoD when it said that that the Chinese would lose. Most of the ones I saw said we'd lose.
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, the United States' longstanding policy is to acknowledge the Chinese position that there is one China, and that Taiwan is a part of it. We don't accept, we don't agree to it. China wants us to, but we merely acknowledge it. But that's I think tangential to the broader point, which you're asking about, or the point that you're making, which is that, yes, we do. The United States does conduct a lot of war games that involve Taiwan scenarios, and the United States loses a lot of those war games. But the broader contextual point is that war games are designed to put stress on or to test a certain capability. They're not designed to take a sort of whole of country approach to examining a challenge. The reality is that in the course of human history, there never has been two countries with nuclear capabilities, long range strike capabilities, space capabilities, and cyber capabilities that have ever fought against each other. So if the United States and China ever did find themselves in conflict over Taiwan, it would be something that lacks any historic precedence. I hope we never do. But if we ever do find ourselves in a conflict over Taiwan, I think it would be a failure of imagination to assume that it will be decided between dogfights between fighter pilots from the United States and China over the Taiwan Strait, or naval maneuvers in the Taiwan Strait between U.S. and Chinese vessels. The reality is that this will be a sprawling global enterprise where the United States and China will each be looking for and working to exploit the other side's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And we've seen this in the case of our response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where the United States moved swiftly. It exceeded Russia's expectations, and it tried to really put pressure upon Russia's continuing ability to wage war. And we'll see how that plays out over time. But the same principle would be applied in the event of a conflict with China if we ever got there, and I hope we never do.
Okay, great. All right, so Brandon is next. Go ahead.
All right,
And already you've been to World Boss many times, but I'm going to remind people that at World Boston questions end with question marks. The tradition we have. Go ahead.
My question mark is, first of all, thank you for such an interesting talk. I wanted to sort of zoom out a bit from the sort of military aspect, sort of zoom into the sort of role that domestic insecurity, sort of that psychological insecurities in the US and also in China. What sort of role do they play in this broader sort of conversation?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, Brandon, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important question. And I think that it's really at the heart of a lot of the challenges that exist in the US-China relationship today. I've sometimes talked about the US-China relationship as being on a downward trajectory, and the United States and China are both locked into the cockpit. But instead of trying to find the maneuvering device to pull us out of this downward trajectory, we're arguing with each other over whose fault it is that we are in a downward trajectory. And part of the reason why I think that that's happening is because both sides feel aggrieved by the other's actions, both feel a certain insecurity about the other's actions, both believe that the other has hostile intent toward each other, and both can find data points to justify or validate their convictions about each other. And when you have an absence of cooperation, a very limited degree of communication, and a series of actions that pile up, it hardens views in both countries. And we can see that more readily in the United States because we're a free society where we're allowed to have polling. And we can see that, there's I think a 73% disapproval rating of China in the United States right now, which is either a historic high or near a historic high. I can't tell you what the polling looks like in China because that's not how they roll. But anecdotally, it seems to be the case that there is a sort of mirroring effect taking place where public attitudes in China increasingly are viewing the United States as implacably hostile and bent upon suppressing China's rise because we're insecure and anxious about the rate of China's growth. And so these are festering, troubling dynamics that I think are really at the heart of the challenge in the broader US-China relationship today.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I have a question about TSMC. How did it come to be that it's the only company that actually produces 90% of the semiconductors? I mean, Intel and AMD, why don't they do that as well? I mean, what's the story behind that? Why did Taiwan become the pole of the world for semiconductors? And follow-up is, why doesn't TSMC, knowing that it's in a precarious position, actually strategically secure the company by moving some of its manufacturing offshore into third countries?
Thanks.
It's a great question, and I should start out by saying that I hope the Celtics prevail tonight. Appreciate your spirit. The story of TSMC is really a fascinating story. It at its heart, it has a sort of a story of an individual, Morris Chang, who's this visionary who grew up bouncing around between mainland China and Hong Kong, moved to the United States for college. I think he lived in Boston for some time, and then he moved to Texas Instruments. He worked for 30 years at Texas Instruments, had a very successful career, was passed up for CEO, offered an opportunity to go to Taiwan instead to start this company that would do something that didn't make sense to anyone at the time, which was to become a foundry that would produce the chips that are designed by other companies. And so Intel and these other companies could just do the work of designing the chips and then outsource it to TSMC to use low cost, fairly highly subsidized production methods to produce the chips, to increase profit for Intel and transfer some of the costs to the Taiwan taxpayers. And this process worked so well that it just continued going and going and going and going to the point where we are today, where TSMC is, I would argue, the most consequential, important company in the world for the global economy. When Taiwan went through COVID-19 and had to slow down production of chips, I don't know if any of you saw, but Ford and GM and others had to close their production facilities and send their workers home until TSMC could produce the chips, send them to the United States so that the production lines could continue running. That's a short, brief interruption for a limited amount of time, and that's the effect that it had. If we were to take TSMC offline for a longer period of time, the ripple effects through the global economy would be catastrophic. And it wouldn't just be General Motors and Ford that would suffer. Really, every major company in the world would have their factories sort of run into a bit of a standstill. And that's why Taiwan matters so much to not just us, but to the world. And why doesn't, the second part of your question, why doesn't TSMC hedge against this risk by building production facilities elsewhere in the world? Well, they're starting to. They have announced plans to invest $40 billion with a B, $40 billion in a fabrication plant in Phoenix area. They're looking at doing production in Japan and they're also exploring the possibility of Germany. Now, this will take some time. Fabrication plants don't just pop up overnight. And so it's critical that we sort of buy ourselves time through this window to allow for the hedging strategy that you're suggesting to sort of take root. And that's why I think that there is a certain benefit in this moment for us to maximize war preparation, but minimize provocation to get ourselves through this window of vulnerability.
Great. Okay, so we'll get a couple of questions from Zoom, and then Leslie, you can go up after those.
This is from Zoom, Matthew Fulco. How do you think a victory by Taiwan's political opposition in the 2024 presidential election, either the Chinese Nationalist Party or Taiwan People's Party, would affect cross-strait relations?
Right. The question is, what would be the effect if Taiwan's opposition parties, one of the opposition parties, were to win the 2024 presidential election? So Taiwan is going to have their presidential elections in January of next year. And the current president in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, is term limited, so she will depart. And it's an open contest as to who will replace her. Her vice president, William Lai Ching-te, is the candidate for the ruling party to carry on her torch. But he is going up against a politician named Ho Yo-i, who's a former police chief, native Taiwanese, who is the torchbearer of the opposition party. And the opposition party is the Kuomintang. They are viewed, I think, as having more willingness to engage with China. Their argument to the Taiwan people is, if you don't want war, vote for us, because we know how to talk to the Chinese. We can manage this without escalation. The ruling party's argument is that the Chinese have an insatiable appetite to absorb Taiwan, and that the best and only defense against that is to move closer to the United States and other countries around the world to sort of guard against and gird against that pressure. And so there is a philosophical divide that's on display and will be decided by the Taiwan voters in January. And just to add one final footnote to this, this all was sort of visible on split screen a few weeks ago, Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan's president, was transiting through the United States, where she met with the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, in California, and a bipartisan delegation of, I think, over 20 members of Congress. At the same time as she was doing that, the former president from the opposition party, Ma Ying-jeou, was in China, where he was traveling around the country leading a youth delegation to show that they know how to work with their counterparts and cousins across the Taiwan Strait. So this is going to be a fascinating election to watch. If to be, direct in answering the question, if the opposition party were to win the 2024 election, I think it would reduce heat around cross-strait issues in the near term. But it's unclear beyond that whether or not they would be able to sustain a lowering of the temperature in the cross-strait dynamic, because I think Beijing would have growing expectations of their ability to pull Taiwan closer. Typically, Beijing tries to deter Taiwan from moving away from China when the DPP is in power, and tries to pull Taiwan closer to China when the Kuomintang KMT is in power. So they will have growing expectations, and that could, generate heat.
Thanks.
This is from Mark Schneider. Is there a massive political will mismatch that means the U.S. cannot win? The CCP has said for 70 years they intend to incorporate Taiwan and see it as an existential threat. Contrast that with the U.S., which has shown for decades a complete inability to withstand casualties compounded by internal divisions.
So this is a really important question, and I don't know the answer to it. But here's my perspective, and I welcome others to challenge it. The argument that Beijing makes is that the balance of fervor favors them, that they care so much more about Taiwan than the United States does. So if push comes to shove, if we start exchanging blows with each other, the United States will step back in recognition of the fact that China is willing to go all the way, expend any cost, accept any risk in service of trying to win a conflict over Taiwan. In part because they can't afford to lose. The argument or the logic is that if the Chinese Communist Party fought a war and lost, then they would likely lose everything. They would undermine their own legitimacy to lead the country, and so they will go as far as needed. So that's the argument that Beijing really tries to advance, and it's possible that may be the case. But as I look back at American history, the lesson that I sort of take looking at various phases of American history is the high degree of American complacency until we're punched in the nose, and then a absolutely insatiable commitment to winning once we are. Now, there are exceptions to that. Afghanistan, Vietnam would be examples, but the pattern I think of American history has been complacency until confronted, and then once hit in the face, a real sort of overwhelming reaction. And in the nature of a great power contest between the United States and China, where sort of leadership of the world in the 21st century would hang in the balance, I think the United States would be very committed.
Okay, great. So Leslie, go right ahead.
Ryan, thank you for your comments tonight. My question was actually going to be about the 2024 election, so I'm doing a quick shift and picking up on a comment that Mary made in her opening remarks, which was about U.S.-Taiwan trade initiatives underway. And to your point about the importance of viewing Taiwan not as a pawn, but as a friend and partner, can you talk a little bit about some of the things we're doing with Taiwan now? I know we're limited because of China's sensitivities and even other countries' sensitivities to doing certain formal things by way of trade agreements, but can you just tell us a little bit about what's underway right now on the commercial front?
Well, this is a ringer's question from a former trade professional in Washington, so I'll do my best. But thank you for the question, Leslie. The United States, the weakness of its overall strategy and approach to Taiwan has been the trade aspect. We're very committed militarily, politically to Taiwan. It's just not reflected on the trade side, and it hasn't been for some time. This isn't a new phenomenon. This has been an enduring bug of America's approach to Taiwan. And part of it, as Leslie pointed out, is the fact that it's sort of complicated. We don't have a state-to-state relationship with Taiwan. There's a certain degree of ambiguity about when and under what circumstances Congress would need to weigh in to ratify any agreement we reach with Taiwan. And there's also, the China factor, which looms in the background. The other issue is that the United States has finally gotten around to promoting a regional trade initiative called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is in the process of being negotiated. But in order to attract countries from across Asia to join us in this journey, they said, please don't involve Taiwan. That'll make it difficult for us to get involved. And so Taiwan is now separate from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. They're separate from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. They're separate from the CPTPP, whatever acronym that stands for, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so Taiwan is being left behind as all this regional economic integration takes place. And as a consequence, they are being disadvantaged relative to their peers in the region. And so what Leslie was talking about was this new initiative to try to catch Taiwan up with the rest of the region and with our trade negotiations with other countries in the region. And there are some preliminary signs that we are making progress on sort of a chapter by chapter basis. But there are limits to what we are doing. We are not discussing trade liberalization. We're not discussing a free trade agreement. If we're sort of on the outer edge of optimism, I think that we would have an agreement to eliminate double taxation so that Taiwan companies like TSMC that produce in the United States aren't taxed in the United States and then taxed in Taiwan as well. But in the grand scheme of things, this is rather small ball, but it's reflective of sort of all these dynamics at work.
Okay, so we'll go to Zoom again.
This is from Nat Whitney. If China can successfully influence the media that citizens consume, do you think they can change the minds of the Taiwanese and elect more friendly to China politicians? Is this a path that China should take?
Well, thank you for the question. I don't want to give the Chinese any advice, so I'm not going to answer the second part of whether or not China should take this path. But what I will say is that it's not a hypothetical, it's a reality. The Chinese are actively working on influencing the media in Taiwan. If you look at where influence operations, disinformation, and cyber activities are most intense in the world, Taiwan would sort of be at or near the top of the list. Taiwan is the test bed that China uses to try to refine and improve all these techniques. And there are media outlets in Taiwan that are called green or red outlets because they have ownership or influence by Beijing. And so the people of Taiwan don't lack for any sort of exposure to views from the mainland, but they've shown themselves to be pretty discerning in what information they absorb and how they do it. And Taiwan's government has become among the most sophisticated in the world in sort of countering on a real-time, ongoing basis disinformation efforts that are taking place today from Beijing.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your remarks. I have a question regarding the NineDash line. And so, people seem to really focus their concentration on the resources that are based upon land, which is semiconductors. But we also have maritime resources. And if reunification occurs, then it will eradicate the NineDash Line, and whereby the territorial sea line is now going to be pushed out from the south by 12 miles. So my question to you is, who is looking at this from a healthcare analytics standpoint? Because when you are dealing with a country that has a lack of arable land, they're looking at a crisis right now in terms of lack of arable land. They are going to see increased dependency upon maritime resources, and we will no longer have the NineDash. So the territorial sea will be moved out by 12. So I'm just curious to know what your interpretation will be of that. Thank you.
Well, I'll try to address this, but if I don't, please come back to me on this. Look, I think that both China and Taiwan share a food insecurity. They're both unable to produce enough food to feed their populations. And this is a vulnerability that they both face. And that's part of the reason why Chinese fishing fleets have become more aggressive in the South Pacific, off the coast of South America, and in other parts of the world. They're the most aggressive fishing fleet of any country in the world in terms of extracting resources to try to address this insecurity and vulnerability that they face. If China were to absorb Taiwan, I don't think it would alleviate food insecurity for either China or Taiwan. I think it would, complexify the problem for the United States and others, because over 60% of the world's maritime commerce travels through the South China Sea in the areas that you're describing and discussing. And so that would be a tremendous concern, I think, for the United States. But ultimately, I think that the United States and China sort of find themselves in a stalemate in the South China Sea. And this sort of takes a half step away from the specific question that you're asking. But, China in the South China Sea would like the United States to just butt out, leave, let the South China Sea become a Chinese lake, where they're able to control access and sort of resolve the territorial disputes with other claimants on their own. And the United States is determined to stay in the South China Sea and is not going anywhere. We continue to fly, sail, and operate everywhere the international law allows. And we're determined to continue doing so because we think that keeping that vital maritime route open is critical to the functioning of the global economy. And unless the United States is willing to push China off of its artificial islands, or China is willing to risk a military conflict with the United States to push American naval and air vessels out of the South China Sea, we're both going to live in this sort of unsatisfying status quo that we're in today.
Sure, sure. Peter Kelly, can you comment on Japan's perspective on Taiwan? It's an important American ally, has its own relationship with China, and would doubtless be involved in any kind of conflict.
Well, Peter, thank you for the question. I think Japan views Taiwan as existential to their security because I think the Japanese strategic view is that if China were to occupy Taiwan, then Japan would be flanked to its south and would not be able to defend its southern island. And so the Japanese are determined to try to prevent that outcome from occurring. And they're also, I think, sober to the fact that if we ever were in a war involving Taiwan, that the United States would rely heavily upon our bases, our military bases in Japan, to field assets and to defend Taiwan, which would make Japan a target of Chinese missiles. And so I think the Japanese feel like they're all in on the Taiwan issue, and that they need to stay closely linked up. At the same time, they're pretty prudent about the way that they approach Taiwan itself, because they know that the more visible they are in being in Taipei and showing support for Taiwan, the more that it has an escalatory effect on dynamics in the Taiwan Strait.
Great, thank you. All right, lightning round. Go right ahead, Heather.
Super fast, actually a follow-up. I'm very interested in Heather O'Brien. Thanks so much for your wonderful remarks. The U.S. building an alliance structure to help preserve peace in the Taiwan Strait and to support our important partner Taiwan, both with general peace and security in Northeast Asia, with Japan, South Korea, our new bases in the Philippines. Could you talk a little bit about the U.S. building that alliance structure to help maintain the peace? Thanks.
Yeah, and I promise I'll be efficient. But, it's a really important question, because if you sort of take a step back from Taiwan, zoom out a bit and look at the regional context, Japan is significantly expanding the resources that it's allocating in its own defense. They're going to develop counterstrike capabilities and other military capabilities that they have not had since the end of World War II. But that process they've committed to do this, they've publicly announced it, but that process will take, several years to bear fruit. Japan and South Korea have improved their relationship and overcome some of their historical animosities. That's building greater cohesion in Northeast Asia. The Philippines, which is just to the south of Taiwan, has opened up 4 additional military bases to U.S. use and access. Going further south, Australia has agreed with the United States and the United Kingdom to begin building nuclear-powered submarines and other capabilities that would be used in a future Taiwan contingency. So the overall strategic landscape in Asia is trending very favorably to the United States' desire to build this integrated network of relationships that shrinks China's space to throw its weight around and establish a sphere of influence. But it's going to take time. None of these things happen overnight. They're going to take at least a decade to sort of come online. And so just to close where I was earlier, that's why we need to buy ourselves time through this coming decade. And if we do, I think we'll be in a pretty strong position.
All right, Ryan Hess, man of a million answers. Thank you. Thank you so much for that great talk, so informative. We really covered a lot on one little island and around the world. So folks, thank you so much for being here. Also, what great questions we had tonight. World Boston, yeah. Anyway, so we're here until 7:30. Please pick up a book. Please pick up some chat and pick up some chowder. And we'll see you on the 31st at Great Decisions on Latin America in Boston Public Library. Thank you. Good night.